Hey guys, welcome back. We're doing predictions for UFC Fight Night 123, Swanson versus Ortega. Follow me on Twitter. My link is in the description at MMA Breakdown 0. Coming off of a profitable event, UFC 218, made the most money that I have on any event since I started betting. Not a huge sum, and not as much as I could have made had all my bets paid out, but still it was the most profitable night for me, so feeling good about that. I think it's another step in the right direction, and hopefully we can continue to be successful going forward here. But my main bets were Ngannou inside the distance, Reyes inside the distance. Won big on both of those. And I was so sad that Charles Oliveira couldn't pull off the submission. I put a smaller bet on a parlay of Oliveira by sub and Cejudo. And man, Oliveira was so close. So I don't regret making that bet. I would have, made that bet a million times over, and he was very close to getting it. Probably would have doubled my payout had that bet been the winning bet. But even with that loss, still ended up being the most profitable night for me. So happy about that. But on to the next event, and check the description. I will be doing my predictions for the event after this one, UFC on Fox, Lawler versus Dos Anjos. I'm going to be doing that, have that out at the same time as this pretty much. So check the description for a link to that video. Alright, fight past prelims at middleweight, Antonio Braga Neto versus Trevin Giles. I really like Giles here. Pretty confident in this pick. Braga Neto appears to have some dangerous submission skills. Finished Anthony Smith by knee bar in his UFC debut, which was several years ago at this point. I think that was 2013 or 4 or 5 years ago, something like that. Yeah, 2013, and only fought once after that against Clint Hester. And I actually had assumed that this guy was cut or something and fighting in other organizations over the years, but his last fight against Clint Hester was his last fight. Hasn't fought since then, so that's already something working against him here. Hasn't fought in 3 years, and that fight against Clint Hester, he got his ground game nullified. He got stuck under Hester on the ground, and Hester just kind of outworked him, stifled his submission game, and I thought it was kind of an embarrassing performance because Hester is not a well-rounded fighter, and historically has been weak on the ground, and he shut him down. Trevin Giles, coming off of his debut win, I can't remember the opponent's name. I think it was the 200, or not the 200, but the last July 4th card. And his ground game, his top position, his passing looked really good. It looks like a really strong top position grappler. And eventually, I believe he got back mount and just knocked his opponent out cold with ground and pound from back mount. I was really impressed, and just looked like a really solid, powerful grappler and athlete. And if Braga Neto was shut down by Clint Hester, I think an actually impressive grappler like Giles, who actually does seem to have a well-rounded, competent MMA game, I think is going to hurt him if he gets on top of him. So I'm going Giles here. I think he can probably get the finish. I wouldn't go so far as to bet on him inside the distance, but I am going to be placing a bet on Giles for this event. All right, at bantamweight, Alejandro Perez versus Yuri Alcantara. Even though Alcantara has been on a downslide, I still think that he should win this one fairly comfortably. Alejandro Perez, pretty limited with his game. He's trying to be a more technical kickboxer, and he's okay at it, but you know, his striking was really exposed in his last fight against Andre Soukhamthath. Really had trouble closing the distance and landing shots. And his wrestling really saved him in that fight, but I still wouldn't say he's a great wrestler. And I don't think, you know, isn't really a submission threat. Alcantara, still dangerous, even if he's getting beaten up in a fight like against Luke Sanders. Still has those submissions in his back pocket that he can always threaten with. And, you know, I just feel like on the feet, Alcantara, a lot more aggressive and a lot more lethal with his striking. And I think he's got a big speed advantage. But I would like to bet on this one. I won't, though, just because Alcantara seems to really kind of be fading the Luke Sanders fight and then the Brian Kelleher fight. Just tapping to a totally, you know, unset up guillotine very early in the fight. I think he's, you know, just kind of on his way out. But Perez, I don't think, you know, has a refined enough game or is dangerous enough with any part of his game to really take advantage of that. So I still like Alcantara here. I'm probably going to take him by decision. All right, at lightweight, Chris Gruetzmacher versus Davi Ramos. I'm going to take Gruetzmacher here, but I don't like this fight, and I think it's weird and kind of a tough one to call. Davi Ramos lost his debut against Sergio Moraes, and it was just a really kind of inactive performance, and he kind of seems to, that seems to be his fighting style, watching some of his pre-UFC fights, and that's why I'm taking Gruetzmacher, because he at least looks to mix it up. He's a pretty good dirty boxer, and looks for the clinch and looks for the tie-up. He was actually one of the guys on his season of Tough that I was kind of impressed with, you know, for a tough level talent. And then won his fight in the UFC against his fellow Ultimate Fighter Abner Yovaris. But it wasn't that impressive or dominant of a win. I thought that fight could have gone to Yovaris. He seemed to really have the striking advantage in that fight and really controlled range better than Gruetzmacher. And then Chaz Skelly, once he was able to get Gruetzmacher on the ground and take his back, submitted him pretty easily. So, you know, Gruetzmacher's not a guy I trust. Ramos, being Brazilian and being a jiu-jitsu competitor, if he's able to get this on the ground, I could see him taking the back, subbing Gruetzmacher, but I just don't like Ramos's inactivity. And I think Gruetzmacher, just being more scrappy and producing more offense, I think he stands a chance of kind of edging Ramos here over 3 rounds. So I'm going to go with Gruetzmacher by decision, but that's kind of a toss-up. Definitely not confident in that one. All right, FS1 prelims at bantamweight, Frankie Saenz versus Merab Dvalishvili. I'm going to take Saenz based off of very little footage that I was able to find on Dvalishvili. basically looks like a really dangerous knockout artist. Has a couple of first round knockouts. At least those were the fights of his that I was able to watch. And that's about it. That's all I was able to really gather from his fight footage. And, you know, we just saw Muslim Salikov, this guy who was super hyped up coming in the UFC and fighting a guy who had really been struggling lately and had been put away, you know, in recent fights. And what was the guy's name? Not coming to me right now, but you know, he got worked in that fight, got taken down, out wrestled, and submitted pretty easily. And I kind of feel that's what's going on here with Dvalishvili, at least, that, you know, doesn't have as complete a game as someone like Saenz, who's still a pretty solid, gritty wrestler. Definitely losing a step athletically, I think, and doesn't have a great chin. You know, Eddie Wineland stopped him pretty harshly, and you know, who's the Augusto Mendez gave him a pretty tough fight. You know, jiu-jitsu guy gave him a pretty tough 3-round boxing fight, and it was really close. So Saenz, you know, definitely not a consistent fighter, not a guy you can really trust, especially against a really dangerous knockout artist like Dvalishvili. But just because in the couple of fights of his I was able to see, the fact that I didn't see much else besides just trucking guys, I got to go with Saenz here, who has the wrestling ability. All right, at flyweight, Carl-Jean de Tomas versus Alex Perez. I'm going to take Alex Perez. I think he's probably going to submit John de Tomas, who struggled very badly against Inoue, whatever the guy's name is, in his debut. Just got, you know, the guy's a wrestler, but his grappling ability is totally exposed. Just got caught in a spider web all fight long in that fight. Inoue was able to put him in, you know, awkward submissions from all kinds of positions, and just never seemed to be able to get out of that rut in that fight. And he hit some decent takedowns early in the fight, but, you know, just on the mat, couldn't hang at all. And Perez had a nice submission over Gray on the Contender Series. And I just think John de Tomas, after that fight, did not look like a UFC level fighter. I mean, I guess has some kind of wrestling background. He's from Guam. I, you know, get the feeling that the wrestling level there is pretty low compared to, you know, U.S. wrestling. But yeah, I just feel that he's not a true UFC level talent. So I'm going to take Perez by submission. All right, at bantamweight, Luke Sanders versus Andre Soukhamthath. Really hard for me to see Soukhamthath winning this after giving up the fight against Alejandro Perez, which he, you know, still deserved to win. I thought he got robbed in that fight. But, you know, even after just owning Alex Perez on the feet, countering him very effectively, and just being in total control of the striking, to give up takedowns against a guy who's not really a dominant wrestler at all, you know, enough to convince the judges that he lost the fight, you know, does not give me confidence at all here that he can prevent going to the ground with Sanders, who's really aggressive, has the athleticism to complement that aggression. I could see him getting a little wild with his hands, rushing in, trying to close the distance, and Soukhamthath countering him, taking advantage of his length and his reach. But I think Sanders just pushes too high a pace and will be able to find that takedown. If Alejandro Perez could do it, I think Sanders will. Soukhamthath also gave up takedowns against Albert Moraes and got his back taken in that third round, gave the fight away again, giving up position on the ground. So I think that's a struggle for this guy. Sanders, really strong scrambler, almost put away Alcantara. Was fighting very impressively in that fight before getting subbed. So yeah, I like Sanders, and this is one that I'm probably going to place a bet on. All right, at women's flyweight, Alexis Davis versus Liz Carmouche. Let me start off by saying that I hate this fight. I don't see any point to it. I hated the first fight. It was one of the few fights that actually put me to sleep while I was watching it live. I remember, when I was watching it, back then, 4 years ago, the fight started and Liz Carmouche was just kind of circling the cage with her back to the fence, and Alexis Davis just kind of following her and occasionally landing some leg kicks. And I fell asleep, woke up in the third round, and Liz Carmouche was still circling the fence with Davis just kind of very robotically just following her. And I rewatched the entire fight, and that's basically the story of it. I don't know, Davis has been more active than Carmouche, but I feel like Carmouche's wins over Chookagian and Lauren Murphy are more relevant wins than Davis's wins over Sarah Kaufman and Cindy Dandois. If Davis can get it to the ground, she should be able to still have the advantage there and control Carmouche. She did hit a takedown in their first fight and got some decent control time, scored some points on the ground. And she's done some impressive things even in her losses, like against Sarah McMahon. Was really threatening with her guard and landed some damaging elbows from her back on McMahon before getting submitted. But I just think Carmouche, she's probably going to be more assertive here than that first fight, where she literally was just circling the fence the whole fight. She looked like Tyron Woodley. And I think she can probably hit some takedowns on Davis. And if she doesn't get subbed, I think she can win some rounds just holding top position. I mean, Dandois, even though she lost that fight and got outworked from top position, she was still able to hold down Davis and take her down. And Carmouche, I think, probably still good enough of an athlete and a strong enough wrestler where she could probably have those stretches of control time. So I'm going to take Carmouche, but I think this is just a super close one, a super weird fight, and definitely advising against any bets on this one. I really think it could go either way. All right, at bantamweight, Albert Moraes versus Benito Lopez. This is another super weird fight. Benito Lopez, another guy coming off of the Contender Series, and he's a very wild striker, almost like Sean O'Malley, but with even less technique and a lot less structure and composure to his striking. And I think he's a little too green and reckless for Moraes here, who looked terrible against Brett Johns. Didn't even look that good against Soukhamthath. I think his really only good performance in the UFC has been against Thomas Almeida, where he engaged him on the feet and took his back briefly in that fight. But all of his other fights have been pretty competitive, pretty close, or Brett Johns just totally exposing his lack of takedown defense. I'm still going to go with Moraes, though. I mean, Lopez, I think, certainly could, just throw enough crazy stuff, throw enough volume to outpoint him on the feet, maybe land a flashy shot or something, goes for a lot of flying knees and things of that nature. But Moraes still has a decent takedown game. If he's not the one getting taken down, uses takedowns to take the third round from Soukhamthath in a close fight, and got the body triangle from the back, held him there to seal that round. And I just think a guy as wild as Lopez is probably going to tire and give up opportunities for Moraes to take him down. And Moraes on the feet is also a lot more composed and controlled, even though he's also not... he definitely won't be as high volume or as confident a striker as Lopez, but I think I have to go with Moraes because of the takedowns and just being a more cautious fighter. So I'm going to go with Moraes by decision, but that's another one that I could totally see Lopez just outworking him with volume and landing crazy stuff. All right, at middleweight, Eric Anders versus Marcus Perez. I'm going with Anders here. Perez, Brazilian fighter, making his debut, and I just didn't see anything from the couple of pre-UFC fights that I was able to watch that really impressed me. Most of his wins are him, mounting guys and just smashing them. Seems to be a guy who doesn't have a ton of striking skill and is just looking to wrestle guys down and smash them from top. Whereas Eric Anders, I think, is much more of a natural athlete, has big power, coming off of a pretty impressive win against Natal in his debut, especially because Natal is a really experienced veteran, and Anders just came in and blew through him. And I think that Anders, he makes his top control time count a lot more. I think his ground and pound is a lot more effective and devastating when he's able to get that position. So I'm going to go with Anders by finish. But, we still haven't seen much of his entire game. If he's put on his back here and continuously taken down, and if he's made to fight off takedowns and work his takedown defense here, I could see him losing that battle, just getting out grappled. But I think there is a difference in athleticism here, as well as just kind of a natural ability to get the finish. I think Anders is the more dangerous fighter, so Anders by finish. At lightweight, Scott Holtzman versus Daryl Horcher. I think this is a really interesting matchup. Really excited for this one. Both guys have similar skill sets. I think on paper, Horcher is probably the stronger wrestler and probably has a little bit more natural power in his hands. But I think that, you know, after the Devin Powell fight, I think it's kind of evident that Horcher, I know he had a bad injury, I believe, from a motorcycle accident. I believe he had a knee injury or something that you know, was pretty serious. And after watching that Devin Powell fight, kind of seems to me like he's, you know, permanently affected by that. Just something about his movement doesn't seem to have kind of the natural explosion that you would expect from a guy with his skill set, you know, a wrestle boxer. And Devin Powell was really chopping him down with leg kicks in that fight, and even took him to a split decision, which, you know, I had to go back and rewatch the fight. I remembered I remembered Horcher winning it pretty clearly, but you go back and watch it, and it was a tough fight. Powell, you know, had him in a bad position to end the fight in the third round. He was working a choke in that fight, and you know, it was landing those leg kicks throughout the fight, and just made it pretty tough on Horcher. And you know, it seemed to be more of the physical limitations, the kind of physical struggle that gave Horcher trouble, more so than a skill difference. So I think that Holtzman, you know, he throws a lot more volume, is a lot more assertive with his striking. He can work leg kicks, and not a bad wrestler himself. I think he's gonna, you know, push a pace that's a little too high for Horcher here. They won't be able to keep up with, and he has the volume advantage. And he's a guy who, you know, doesn't make these drastic improvements fight to fight, but you know, I think is getting better, and you know, just always kind of refining his technical kickboxing ability. You know, even in the Josh Emmett fight, Emmett came out, you know, throwing big haymakers and taking him for some big rides, but he withstood the storm in that fight, and he, you know, hit a takedown on Emmett in that fight. The guy's a tough fighter himself. He's well-rounded, and just seeing Horcher kind of struggle a little bit against a not very physically imposing fighter like Powell, you know, the fact that Powell is able to make that kind of a dogfight and really give him problems with those leg kicks, I think Holtzman can see that and try to replicate some of that success here. So it's kind of I know it's kind of a crazy pick a little bit, but I am going to take Holtzman by decision. Not one I would you know, be willing to take a chance betting on, but I do think that he's going to surprise some people here. I'm certain that he's going to be the underdog when the line's open, but yeah, I don't think I'm going to bet on it, but I'm taking Holtzman to win this. Excuse me. At bantamweight, Marlon Moraes versus Aljamain Sterling. I think Moraes should just be able to outstrike Sterling, because Sterling still lacks a sound fundamental boxing game. But I don't like the fact that, you know, this is a pretty quick turnaround for Moraes, and, you know, the Dawson fight wasn't a war, but it was still a tough fight, and he ate some shots in that fight. And Sterling, even though this guy lacks, you know, a proper boxing game, he still managed to take Rafael Assunção to a split decision. and just work those body kicks over and over again to do it. Because of Moraes's lack of urgency and kind of his inactivity, which still kind of plagued him in the Dodson fight, I could see Sterling hitting some of those body kicks, and if he is able to have success with his wrestling, which no one thought he would be able to against Barao, if he's able to take down Moraes and get some control time on the ground, I could see him just being more active, out hustling him for 2 of 3 rounds. So I'm not counting Sterling out here, but it is just kind of hard to ignore his kind of lack of fundamentals on the feet, and I think Moraes should really be able to take advantage of that here after facing 2 elite fighters in a Sun Sao and Dodson, and both of them were very competitive fights. And Sterling also, the Augusto Mendez fight, that was a really competitive fight, and Mendez kind of staggered him in the first round. So I'm going to take Moraes because of the striking, but that's an interesting one. Moraes, I think, is just always going to suffer from being gun shy and hesitant, and Sterling really went after Barao with wrestling, and really headhunted in that fight. And if he does that to Moraes, I wouldn't be surprised if he's able to outwork him. So I'll go Moraes by a decision, but that's an interesting one. All right, at featherweight, Jason Knight versus Gabriel Benitez. I'm going Jason Knight. I think we really saw the limits of Benitez's game and his potential in his loss to Enrique Barzola, but Jason Knight, I think, still kind of a raw striker, gets a little overeager with his striking. He paid for it against Lamas. And Benitez, he's a good counter boxer. A long, sharp counter boxer with some underrated power and some underrated guillotines. I think he can have some success here against Jason Knight that people won't really expect him to, but it's hard to see him actually hurting Knight enough to open up a submission or to actually get the win. I think Knight's just going to be too aggressive, throw too much volume, which was really a problem for Benitez against Barzola. And Knight's got a fast, committed blast double, and I think he can probably put Benitez on his back here, which has also been a struggle for him, since his first fight after TUF against Humberto Brown, and then in the Barzola fight as well. He's not a schooled wrestler or grappler, so I'm going to take Knight. And I think he could probably get the finish here, especially if he gets it on the ground. I expect him to, come out hard on the feet, probably tag him up, and then take it to the ground and submit him. So that's going to be my pick, Knight by submission. But there's just kind of a small voice in my head that's telling me that Benitez is more technical here and can probably give Knight a little bit of trouble with the counter striking. But I'm going to take Knight, and this is actually one definitely not. I think Knight's gonna win, but I don't want to call it a lock. But if I was advising bets for this card, this is definitely one that I would advise over most others. If I was forced to to make a bet in addition to the ones I've already said, like Giles and Luke Sanders. This is probably the one after that that I would look to bet on. So I may be exploring a bet here, but yeah, I'm going to take Knight by finish. All right, a featherweight, Cub Swanson versus Brian Ortega. This, to me, totally depends on which Cub Swanson we get. The Cub Swanson, who is really dynamic, really dynamic with his striking and able to push the pace on Doo Ho Choi and find openings and cut angles. I think that Swanson will beat Ortega, just kind of be too much for him, with the aggression and with the diversity of strikes. But the Cub Swanson that I think we're going to get, and the one that has shown up more often over the last several years, is the one who was pretty gun-shy against a non-threatening fighter in Hakran Diaz, one who inexplicably went 5 rounds against Artem Lobov in what turned out to be a pretty competitive fight, and in hindsight is pretty concerning given how bad Lobov looked against Andre Fili. And yeah, and even, the Tatsuya Kawajiri fight a couple years ago, another one in this run of Swanson just not quite looking the same as he did before that Holloway loss. So yeah, I think Swanson's just kind of fading a little bit. He's still a really talented fighter with a good, when he's on, like against Doo Ho Choi, like I already said, he can really vary his strikes and come forward and find openings, really get into a rhythm on the feet, and can really mix in takedowns well with his striking as well. But I just feel like that's not the guy that we've seen lately. Really bizarre that he went 5 rounds against Lobov and that the fight was as competitive as it was. I mean, I expected him to get Lobov out of there, and that's, what an elite fighter would do against Lobov, because we saw Andre Fili, who's not an elite fighter, almost put him away, and Swanson just looked really kind of stationary and flat-footed in that fight. I think after the Holloway loss, he, kind of, and still is, going through this phase where he's trying to really focus on technique and take less damage, and is really reining in his aggression and his willingness to brawl and open up with his striking. But that's where his strength is, and that's who the guy is. And I don't know if he's also kind of just shop-worn at this point, but I'm just not seeing the old Cub Swanson anymore. Ortega is still a work in progress, especially on the feet, but he improved drastically between the Clay Guida fight and his last fight against Renato Moicano with his striking. Against Guida was just getting picked apart and really not answering back at all, and against Moicano it was a tit-for-tat, kickboxing match where, he really showed a lot more tools on the feet, a jab and kicks, and he was still, taking shots and getting hit, getting landed on, but, it was pretty even, and was able to pull away late in the fight and capitalize with his very dangerous submission game. And I think that's kind of what we're going to get here is, Swanson trying to be really technical and maybe having some early success against Ortega, winning some early rounds. But I think Ortega is going to stick it out and, be there with Swanson until the the later rounds, and then kind of chip away, kind of like Holloway did, and slowly pick apart, wear out Swanson. And I think Swanson may go for a desperate takedown or something like he did against Holloway and get guillotined. Worth noting that Ortega, I believe, might be every one of his submission wins in the UFC has come in the third round. And also, he's not the one taking guys down, putting them on the mat to make use of his submissions. It's almost always guys trying to take him down, where he's able to slap on a choke. But again, just Swanson to me looks like he's fading, and physically, I don't know. I just feel like Ortega's getting a lot more technical, and I just feel like by the end of the fight, Ortega's gonna be the more dangerous guy, the fresher guy at that point, and Swanson's gonna kind of fall apart a little bit as the fight goes on. So I'm taking Ortega by, I'm gonna say 5th round submission, but definitely not one I would bet on, because Ortega's still pretty inexperienced, and again, if the old Swanson shows up, or the Swanson that fought Doo Ho Choi, he could really put it on Ortega. All right, those are my predictions for Fight Night 123. Thank you for watching. Again, I'll have my predictions out for Lawler versus RDA. That video will be linked in the description, so check that out. Follow me on Twitter at MMA Breakdown 0. Went a little bit long here, I think, with this one, but thank you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.